March 25th, long before Christianity spread across the Roman Empire. Dawn breaks over the city of Rome. The streets that were silent in mourning just hours before now erupt in jubilant celebration. Crowds gather, adorned in colorful garments and spring flowers, their faces transformed from grief to ecstasy. A thunderous cry echoes through the ancient streets. "He lives! Attis has returned from the dead!" Fast forward 2,000 years, another springtime dawn. Another joyous proclamation rings out from the churches across the globe. Christ is risen! He is risen indeed! Is it merely coincidence that for centuries before the birth of Jesus, Romans celebrated the resurrection of their god Attis at precisely the same time of year that Christians would later commemorate the resurrection of Christ? That both gods were mourned for 3 days, their bodies laid in tombs, only to triumphantly return. The anchoring of these divine deaths and rebirths to the spring equinox reveals something profound about human religious imagination, but it also raises unsettling questions about the origins of Christianity's central narrative. In this video, we delve into one of history's most provocative religious parallels, how an ancient Phrygian cult that captured the imagination of Rome may have shaped the story Christians tell about their Savior's sacrifice and triumph over death. This is no simple tale of borrowing, but rather a complex interweaving of religious evolution, where the threads of older myths become entwined with the new. You see, what most Christians don't realize is that when the first gospel accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection were being written, Romans had already been celebrating the death and rebirth of Attis for over a century. The spring festival of death and resurrection wasn't new. It was part of Rome's religious DNA. Before we tell the story of Easter, we must first walk the ancient streets of Rome and witness a far older resurrection drama, one that holds startling parallels to the narrative that would eventually replace it. In the wind-swept mountains of ancient Phrygia, centuries before the birth of Christ, worshippers raised their voices to Cybele, the Magna Mater, great mother of the gods. Her temples dotted the rugged landscape from which her cult emerged. As mother of the gods, Cybele embodied the fertile earth itself, but her myth was inseparable from that of a beautiful youth named Attis, a shepherd prince whose tragic fate would echo through centuries and eventually resonate with another story of divine sacrifice. According to the legends, Attis was born miraculously to the nymph Nana, who conceived him after placing an almond seed in her bosom, a virgin birth that required no male intervention. The great mother Cybele fell deeply in love with the beautiful youth, but Attis's destiny led to tragedy. In one version, he was slain by a wild boar. In another, more widely known version, he was driven mad as a divine punishment and castrated himself beneath a pine tree, bleeding to death on the sacred spot. The grief-stricken Cybele mourned terribly, but remarkably, Attis did not remain dead. Through Cybele's divine power and overwhelming love, Attis was restored to life, transformed into an immortal being, tied to the evergreen pine, or in some tellings, fully resurrected to divine status. What's remarkable about Attis is that his story contains elements that will appear strikingly familiar to Christians: miraculous birth, sacrificial death, and resurrection through divine intervention. And all of this was being celebrated centuries before Jesus walked in Galilee. By the 6th century BCE, worship of the Great Mother was widespread across Anatolia, from mountain sanctuaries to city temples. But it was in 204 BCE that Cybele's cult would take a momentous journey west. Amid Rome's desperate war against Hannibal, Roman leaders consulted the prophetic Sibylline books, which declared that Rome would prevail if it brought the Idaean mother, Cybele, to Italy. The Romans, eager for divine favor, imported her sacred black stone from Pessinus. With great ceremony, the Magna Mater was installed in a temple on the Palatine Hill Along with Cybele came her entourage of strange Eastern priests and practices. Roman society was both fascinated and cautious. Cybele's priests, the Galli, were eunuchs who performed ecstatic dances with drums and cymbals, honoring the memory of Attis's self-castration. At first, Roman law forbade citizens from becoming Galli, reflecting fear of this foreign cult. Remarkably, evidence suggests the earliest Christian leaders were acutely aware of this cult and its practices. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul himself makes a shocking reference that would have been unmistakable to his audience. "I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves." Galatians 5:12. This biting comment directly references the self-castration practices of Cybele's priests, showing that Paul was not only familiar with the cult, but deliberately positioned his message of Christ against it. The Judeo-Christian tradition reflected complex attitudes towards such practices. In ancient Hebrew law, in Deuteronomy, barred eunuchs from religious assembly, yet later prophets like Isaiah offered them a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. By the time of Jesus, the New Testament shows a more inclusive stance, with the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts being baptized without hesitation. This evolving religious landscape created fertile ground for the interchange of ideas. As citizens throughout the empire wrestled with competing religious claims, the well-established cult of Attis, with its powerful narrative of death and rebirth, provided imagery and concepts that would shape how many understood the emerging story of Christ. Yet over time, Romans of all classes fell under the spell of Cybele and Attis, captivated by the drama of a goddess's love and a god who dies and returns. By the reign of Emperor Claudius in the mid-1st century CE, the very period when Christianity was first emerging, the cult had been fully integrated into Roman religious life. Its spring festival officially recognized in the Roman calendar. By the time the earliest Christians were spreading their message about Jesus' resurrection, Romans throughout the empire were already familiar with the concept of a god who dies and returns to life. The cult of Attis and Cybele wasn't some obscure religion. It was mainstream, state-sponsored worship. To understand the power of the cult of Attis and Cybele, we must immerse ourselves in its most dramatic element. The spring festival that Romans called the Holy Week of March, this visceral religious drama played out annually on the streets of Rome and throughout the empire. By the time Christianity emerged, the cycle of death and rebirth was firmly established as a sequence of public ceremonies that mirrored Attis's mythic journey. Let us walk through the days of this remarkable festival. March 15th, Cana Intrat, the reed enters. The festival began with celebrants marking the birth of Attis, found as an infant among river reeds. Processions carried fresh reeds into Cybele's sanctuary, recalling how the goddess discovered the newborn Attis. But the moon soon darkened as the festival turned toward commemoration of Attis's tragic death. March 22nd, Arbor Intrat, the tree enters. Now the atmosphere turned somber. The Dendrophori, tree bearers, dressed in mourning clothes, went into the woods to cut down a pine tree, symbolizing the one under which Attis died. They hung an image of the young god Attis upon the trunk, as if Attis's body were affixed to the tree. With wailing flutes and pounding drums, they carried the tree in procession to the temple of Cybele, laying it to rest inside as a funerary bier. For the next day, ritual lamentations filled the air. The Galli priests and devotees mourned loudly, beating their chest in anguish. The tree, swathed in wool and wreaths of spring violets, was treated as a sacred corpse. Worshippers even abstained from bread, fasting, as Cybele herself was said to have done in her sorrow. March 24th, Day of Blood. The mourning reached a frenzied climax. Historical accounts speak of a frenzy of self-flagellation and devotion. Devotees of Cybele, in empathy with the dead Attis, whipped themselves until blood flowed, sprinkling it on altars as an offering to the goddess. The atmosphere was one of trance-like mourning. Drums and cymbals clanged, flutes shrilled, and the faithful cried out in grief as if Attis had truly died that day. Arnobius of Sicca, writing in the early 4th century, describes this moment vividly. When Attis is being mourned as a corpse, his devotees weep and beat their chests. Afterward, an image of Attis bound to a pine tree is carried forth like a dead body and solemnly buried. As night fell, they placed the effigy of Attis, still entwined with the pine tree, into a tomb or sepulchre within the temple. This burial was no mere symbolism, but a central ritual act that mirrored actual funerary rites. This was the sacred vigil, a time of silent darkness. Ancient writers hint that by this point, many devotees entered altered states of consciousness, awaiting signs of the miracle to come. It is here that the cult's tone pivoted dramatically from despair to hope, a transition that gave the festival its most famous day, March 15th, Hilaria, rejoicing. At dawn, jubilation broke forth. The sorrow of previous days vanished as if the light had pierced into the darkness. According to ancient descriptions, the tomb of Attis was found empty or opened, and the news spread among the initiates. Attis lives! The god who had died was restored to life. Firmicus Maternus, writing in the 4th century, provides us with a direct description of this resurrection ritual. They, the devotees, bury a pine tree in the temple precinct, and on this tree they have fastened an image of a youth, which they mourn with wild lamentations. On the 3rd day, they proclaim that he has risen from the dead, and they rejoice wildly. The parallels to the Christian resurrection narrative are obvious and striking. A buried god, a 3-day interval, an announcement of resurrection, and wild rejoicing among the faithful. The Hilaria was a day of ecstatic celebration. 3rd century writer Damascus remarked that Attis's resurrection on this day signified a liberation from Hades for the initiates. The gates of the underworld had been broken and hope reborn. Attis's resurrection is celebrated with overwhelming joy, a theme mirrored in the Christian tradition from the gloom of Good Friday to the exultation of Easter Sunday. Even the word Hilaria, joy, has a resonance with Alleluia, shouts of Easter for Christians. On this day of joy, all of Rome turned out in festivity. What had been a somber funerary rite suddenly became a carnival of antiquity. Contemporary accounts liken it to a Mardi Gras. Masquerades and comic processions filled the streets. No one was permitted to wear mourning clothes. Instead, people donned colorful costumes and garlands of fresh spring flowers. The statue of Cybele was carried in a lavish procession. Before the goddess's image, people carried the most costly treasures of Rome in a grand parade of gratitude and relief. The long night of winter and death had passed. Spring and rebirth had arrived. It's no accident that March 25th was the first day after the spring equinox, when daylight overtakes darkness. The symbolism was clear to all. The winter with its gloom had died, and the first day of a better season was spent in rejoicing. In the mythic terms of the cult, Attis was resurrected, and with him all of nature, and all faithful souls would share in new life. Devotees believed that Attis's return from death was a promise of their own salvation and immortality. After the exuberance of Hilaria, the festival concluded with quieter ceremonies. March 26 was marked as the Requietio, Day of Rest, and on March 27th, the Lavatio, Washing, saw Cybele's sacred black stone carried to the river Almo for ritual cleansing. This ceremonial cycle, birth, death, mourning, and resurrection, was firmly in place in the Roman world well before the rise of Christianity. By 50 CE, under Claudius, Romans were officially observing Attis' festival, with the full sequence of ceremonies established decades before the Gospels were written. The physical evidence is overwhelming. Inscriptions, altars, temples throughout the empire all attest to the popularity of this resurrection cult. The Attis myth wasn't hidden. It was celebrated publicly throughout the Roman world at exactly the same time Christianity was taking its first steps. As we shift our gaze to ancient Judea in the 1st century CE, another story of death and resurrection begins to unfold, that of Jesus of Nazareth, whose followers proclaimed him the Christ. The parallels between the Attis mythology and the Christian gospel have long fascinated scholars and skeptics alike. Both Attis and Jesus are figures who die a tormenting death and miraculously return to life, both honored by springtime observances that celebrate triumph over death. First, consider the timing. The Hilaria festival of Attis' resurrection fell on March 25th, the date Romans regarded as the spring equinox. And remarkably, early Christians developed a tradition that Jesus' resurrection took place on March the 25th as well. In some early church traditions, it was believed that Jesus was crucified on March 25th. In fact, a North African tradition held that March 25th was both the date of the crucifixion and the date of the Annunciation, Jesus' conception. Now the motifs. In the cult of Attis, the young god's blood fertilizes the earth and brings new life. In Christianity, Jesus' blood shed on the cross is the salvation of the world. Most strikingly, Attis dies under a pine tree, his body symbolically affixed to it in ritual. For Jesus, early Christians repeatedly used a phrase that would have resonated powerfully with anyone familiar, maybe even a cult member of Attis himself, to Attis' story. Throughout the New Testament, Jesus is described as being hung on a tree. Acts 5:30, the God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom ye slew and hanged on a tree. Acts 10:39, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Acts 13:29, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a sepulchre. Galatians 3:13, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. 1 Peter 2:24, who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree. The language choice is remarkable. While the Gospels describe a Roman crucifixion, these passages specifically invoke tree imagery, the same central symbol in Attis' death. For Romans familiar with the annual spectacle of Attis' effigy bound to a sacred pine, hearing that Jesus died on a tree would have created an immediate and powerful association. Attis' body is wrapped and laid in a tomb, and on the third day he is restored. Jesus' body is wrapped in linen in a tomb, and on the third day he rose again. Attis' resurrection is celebrated with overwhelming joy and a sense of general license, mirrored in the Christian notion that the gloom of Good Friday is overturned by the exaltation of Easter Sunday. Both cults offered their followers a hope of overcoming death. Some of the ritual expressions bear uncanny resemblance. Early Christians adopted baptism as a kind of death and rebirth with Christ. Meanwhile, the Attis cult had the Torabolium, a ritual bath in sacrificial bull's blood. An inscription from this ritual declares the initiate reborn for eternity, language strikingly familiar to Christian born-again theology. Christian apologist Justin Martyr, writing around 150 CE, frankly acknowledged to a pagan audience that the Christian story sounded familiar. When we say that Jesus Christ was crucified and died and rose again, we propound nothing new or different from what you believe regarding those whom you call the sons of Jupiter. In other words, Justin admitted that stories of divine men dying and ascending were already circulating in Greco-Roman religion. The concept of a God who dies and rises for the salvation of mankind was familiar in the pagan world long before Christianity. Church father Tertullian later complained that the devil, by the mysteries of his idols, imitates even the main parts of the divine sacraments. This defensive posture itself reveals how obvious the parallels were to people of that time. On the other side, pagan intellectuals also noticed the overlap. The Neoplatonist philosopher and Roman emperor Julian the Apostate in the 4th century wrote a treatise arguing that Christians had appropriated pagan ideas and that there was nothing new in Christian doctrine. Modern scholarship has wrestled for over a century with the question, did Christianity borrow from the cult of Attis and familiar pagan cults? The early 20th century saw scholars like Sir James George Frazer highlight Attis as a prime example of a dying and rising god, whose story predated and paralleled that of Christ. Frazer firmly emphasized Attis's tomb and resurrection as core elements of the Roman cult, explicitly comparing it with Christ's empty tomb tradition. He wrote of Attis, his death and resurrection were annually mourned and rejoiced over at a festival in spring, and did not shy away from the comparison to Easter. More recent scholarship confirms these parallels. M.J. Vermaseren, a leading historian on Cybele and Attis, documented the widespread existence of the tomb tradition, both symbolically in ritual and physically at sacred sites like Pacinus. Robert Turcan in the Cults of the Roman Empire specifically notes the ritual burial of Attis's image within a tomb-like space, clearly associating it with rebirth symbolism. He described how Attis's resurrection was celebrated on March 25th with a wild outburst of glee and held by disciples as a promise that they too would triumph over the grave. Sir James George Frazer and scholars of like mind, such as Sir Samuel Dill, Franz Cumont, and later Joseph Campbell, argued that the ground was fully prepared in the Greco-Roman world for the concept of a resurrected savior god. One eminent scholar of Roman religion, Robert Turcan, mentioned before, notes how fully integrated the Phrygian cult of Cybele and Attis was in the 1st century empire, saying, Phrygianism was thus well and truly officialized. It became popular and imperial. Under Claudius, the Holy Week of Attis was established a century before Christian Easter week even existed. However, this view has not gone unchallenged. Scholars like Jonathan Z. Smith have argued that the category of dying and rising gods was over-applied and that Attis's resurrection is quite different from Christianity's claims. Some point out that Attis's resurrection is not explicitly described in sources until after Jesus' era. The earliest clear textual reference comes from Firmicus Maternus in the 4th century. He whom they had buried a little while earlier came to life again. This has led some scholars to argue that the Attis cult itself might have absorbed the idea of resurrection from Christianity rather than the other way around. However, the archaeological evidence suggests the resurrection theme was present in the Attis cult earlier than the textual record indicates. The structure of the festival itself, with its movement from mourning to joy, only makes sense if there was some form of restoration or resurrection being celebrated. The well-documented existence of Attis's tomb, both in ritual reenactment and as a physical pilgrimage site, provides one of the strongest parallels to the narrative structure found later in the Christian Passion story. Archaeological evidence further strengthens the historical reality of Attis's tomb. At Pacinus, the original heart of the Cybele-Attis cult in Phrygia, modern Turkey, traditions explicitly mentioned the tomb of Attis. The sanctuary contained what devotees considered the actual burial place of Attis. A Phrygian inscription from the 2nd to 3rd century CE even states plainly, "Here lies Attis." This tomb served as a place of pilgrimage for devotees, much like early Christian pilgrimage to the tomb of Jesus. Modern consensus tends to find a middle ground. Certainly, early Christians did not simply copy-paste the Attis legend. The figure of Jesus emerged from Jewish messianic expectations. Yet, the cultural context of the Roman Empire cannot be ignored. Christianity grew up in a Hellenistic world saturated with mystery religions and their potent symbols. Most scholars now agree that Christianity did not emerge in a vacuum. The story of Attis and Cybele provides a compelling example of a pre-Christian religion that celebrated death and resurrection, sacrificial blood, and salvation of devotees. The parallels with Jesus' story are real and were acknowledged by observers in antiquity. Standing amid the ruins of what was once the Temple of Cybele in Rome, or gazing at a marble statue of Attis wearing his Phrygian cap, one can almost hear the echoes of ancient hymns. Attis, the evergreen god, was believed to rise again each spring, bringing life to fields and hope to hearts. The evidence before us is compelling and unmistakable. Before the very first Christian gospel was ever written, Romans throughout the empire celebrated a God who was miraculously born a virgin, died in connection with a tree, his body affixed to it, was wrapped and placed in a tomb. After 3 days of mourning and darkness, had his tomb found empty at dawn, was proclaimed to have resurrected from death, promised his followers eternal life through his victory, was celebrated in spring with a festival, moving from deepest grief to ecstatic joy, offered salvation through blood sacrifice. These are not vague or superficial similarities. These are precise, fundamental parallels embedded in the official religious calendar of Rome, generations before Christianity emerged. The death and resurrection of Attis was not some obscure foreign myth. It was publicly celebrated throughout the Roman world during the very decades when the Christian Gospels were taking shape. When Christianity triumphed and temples to Cybele fell silent, the human yearning they embodied did not disappear. It found new expression in the Easter proclamation, "Christ is risen!" The cult of Attis and Cybele reveals that long before the first Easter, people of the Mediterranean world were already ritually mourning a dead god and rejoicing at his return. They were already asking the eternal questions. Can the grave be overcome? Is there salvation for the mortal soul? In a striking historical irony, under the Vatican Hill, where St. Peter's Basilica now stands, there once existed a Phrygianum, a sanctuary to Cybele and Attis. The transition from the worship of Attis to that of Jesus was effected with seemingly no interruption, for the pagan ceremonies were enacted on a site later taken over by the Christians, the Vatican itself. What we see isn't simple borrowing, but a complex religious evolution. Christianity didn't merely copy Attis worship, but it emerged in a world where the dying and rising God was already a powerful religious archetype. The new faith both rejected and transformed elements of what came before. The parallels between Attis and Jesus do not necessarily diminish either figure. Rather, they illustrate a powerful archetype that seems written in the human religious psyche, the dying and rising God. From Phrygian forest to Jerusalem's hill of Golgotha, the details differ, but the narrative arc is strikingly similar. And the timing, a celebration of resurrection in the spring, speaks to something deep and primal in all of us. An alignment of hope with the rhythms of the earth. The Hilaria and Easter are two manifestations of the same impulse, to defeat death with joy. Today, the cult of Attis is long gone. No crowds chant at his tomb in modern city, but every spring, when Christians mark the passion and resurrection of Jesus, they are unknowingly part of a tradition far older than Christianity. We could highlight early Christians who celebrated Attis and identified Attis directly with Christ, such as the Montanists and Naasene Christians. However, we may need to do a patristic deep dive on that in a future video. How about you let me know your thoughts? Perhaps some ancient Roman, having witnessed the Hilaria, later heard the Christian gospel and thought, I have seen this mystery before. And perhaps he understood the new story better for it. In the echoes of drums that once announced Attis's return, in the shadow of the pine tree that became a cross, and the ancient cry, "Your God is saved, and for you also comes salvation," we glimpse not just coincidence, but the enduring human hope that death itself might somehow be overcome. The names change, the theologies evolve, but the dream of resurrection endures, as ancient as our awareness of mortality, as fresh as each spring that follows winter's death.